Here, as always, truly appreciate it. Go ahead and open up to Matthew chapter 27, and we're going to dive into this lesson, resuming the questions of Pilate, dealing with two more tonight. And certainly two particular questions, at least in regard to a metaphorical sense, they require our attention as we think about and consider our Savior. Of course, like we did last week, let's back up to chapter 26 and let's reread and set the scene for our better understanding of what we're looking at tonight. Starting in verse 57, then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest in Matthew chapter 26, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. And Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death, but they found none. Though many false witnesses came forward, at last two came forward and said, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witness do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spit in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" Then, of course, Peter's denial, the rest of the chapter. And we come into chapter 27, beginning in verse 1. And when morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate the governor. Then we see the regret and remorse of Judas in the following verses, picking up in verse 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" We've considered that. Jesus said, "You have said so." But when he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you hear how many things they testify against you?" But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. And we considered that as well. So we pick up in verse 15 for our purposes tonight. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" Question number one, Barabbas or Jesus? And you see it obviously plain and clear there in verse 17 and verse 18 as we continue reading. For he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Mark's account of this particular statement is found in Mark chapter 15. And if you flip over there real quick, we'll consider that as well. And he answered them, "Do you want me to release to you?" Mark chapter 15 and verse 9. Or do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. Barabbas or Jesus? So Pilate effectively, and this is the way that I understand this, Pilate effectively presented in front of them two very clear choices. One of them was perfect and innocent and blameless. And we know and understand that Barabbas was there because of the insurrection and also murder. So on one hand, you've got an obvious criminal, you've got someone that obviously deserves death, right? Has earned that. And on the other end of the spectrum, we read in verse 17 and verse 18 that it was out of envy that he was delivered. So you've got two people. And at different points, the crowds hated both of them. One of those is innocent, one of those is life, and one of those is terrible. So who do you choose? What do you choose? And I've thought about that so much that it seems in that moment, it seems so clear, doesn't it? Who do you want me to release to you? As somebody that deserves death? And I think, Jesus was crucified with two thieves, right? They were thieves. So as we understand this and as it unfolds for us, Pilate has chosen the worst of the three, knowing or perhaps hoping that they would obviously choose Jesus, release Jesus for us, because he knew it was out of envy that they delivered Jesus to be put to death. And the choice seems so clear, doesn't it? It's so clear. And like I said, I've thought about that so much. And it's so simple, but it's difficult. But that same in a lot of different areas, a lot of different times, situations, that same question keeps coming up. Throughout the whole Bible, it seems so clear and so obvious, but you still have to make the choice. And when it comes to you personally, and me personally, you've got to make the choice. Are you going to choose the the path of destruction and death, or are you going to choose the path of righteousness and light? Consider a few, and this is just scratching the surface of those instances when God's people were presented with options, choices. You got to choose. Moses, at the end of his life in the book of Deuteronomy, the second giving of the law, in Deuteronomy chapter 30, he says this, and we're going to look at this in Deuteronomy 30, beginning in verse 15. See, I have set before you, and again, consider these juxtaposed against Barabbas or Jesus. See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, then you shall live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. But, verse 17, if your heart turns away and you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are going over the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth, verse 19, to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life, that you and your offspring may live. The choice seems pretty clear, doesn't it? I mean, obvious, plain and simple. Just choose life. Just choose to do what is right. Obey God. Moses had a successor named Joshua, and we read about that succession in chapter 31. But Joshua, in similar fashion, at the end of his life, made a very similar claim or charge to the people of Israel. Verse 14 of Joshua chapter 24, it says, Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your father served in the regions beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So again, Joshua, it's a very similar command. Choose whom you're going to serve, life or death, God or the devil. Who you're going to follow. What's it going to be? The choice, it's clear, it's obvious, and it seems so simple, but it's completely up to you. Completely up to you. Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7, gives the description, if you remember, again, similar fashion. This is coming from Jesus. Two choices. Enter by the narrow gate. For the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. Destruction or life. The way is broad. There are so many people that were crying out, crucify him, crucify him. There were very few people weeping over him. Choose this day. What's it going to be? The way of Barabbas or the way of Jesus? Who do you want me to release to you? Jesus to his disciples. It would seem a pivotal moment in his ministry. Jesus has just fed thousands of people in John chapter 6. And then from that discourse, the hordes follow him and he divulges to them, I am the bread of life. This saying is so hard to understand that many people turned away from following him. And Jesus turns in this moment, Jesus turns and looks at his disciples in John chapter 6, beginning in verse 66. And he asks this question. After this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. So Jesus said to the 12, do you want to go away as well? Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. Here are your two options. You can believe and trust and come to know that Jesus is the Holy One of God, or you can find it very difficult and you can turn away. Choices. It's a simple choice, simple decision, A or B, and there's not any in between. The world wants to put a road in the middle where you can have a little Jesus and you can have a little of the world, and it doesn't work that way. Life or death, Jesus or Barabbas, innocence or guilty. So the question, who do you want me to release for you? Barabbas or Jesus? Obviously, the crowd, the Broadway, the majority, screaming at the top of their lungs, Barabbas. Give us Barabbas. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 27 and look at question number 4 of Pilate. What then shall I do with Jesus? Look at verse 22, Matthew chapter 27. Pilate said to them, then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? They all said, let him be crucified. You flip over to Mark, and Mark's account in Mark chapter 15, verse 12 and verse 13. Pilate said to them, then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews? And they cried out again, crucify him. Or consider a little bit of a different twist in John chapter 19. We give our attention to verse 15. They cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. Crucify away. I am appalled as we consider this idea. What shall I do with Jesus? The choice that they made was crucify him, because they had already determined that they should put him to death, that it should be, he deserves to die. They decided that before the court justice system even started. They already decided and had been plotting for quite some time, actually, to put him to death. So what shall I do with Jesus? They would prefer, as they cried out, and we consider, they would prefer the statement, his blood be on us and our children. Can you imagine? His blood be on us, and then throwing your children in there. So what shall we do with Jesus? That's really the question of life, isn't it? What are you going to do with Jesus? What are your options when you consider the grand scheme of redemption? What are you going to do once you have an understanding of the gospel? What do you do? And Jesus lays it out, at least the way that I understand it. Jesus lays it out in 4 basic, rudimentary ways in this parable of the sower. And if you look at Matthew chapter 13, you're going to see it laid out pretty simply. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea, and great crowds, in Matthew chapter 13, beginning in verse 1, great crowds gathered around him, about him, so that he got into a boat and sat down, and the whole crowd stood on the beach, and he told them many things in parables, saying, here it is, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell among the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on the rocky ground, and they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched. And since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears, let him hear. Thankfully, he gives us a very clear understanding beginning in verse 18. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what is sown along the path. As for what is sown on the rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while. And when tribulation or persecution arise on account of the word, immediately he falls away. As for what was sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. As for what is sown on the good soil, this is the one who hears the word, understands it. He indeed bears fruit and yields in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. What are you going to do with Jesus? 4 basic ways that you can receive or reject Jesus. Mostly reject him. Isn't that ironic? 3 out of the 4, if you're into percentages, that would be 75%. 75% of the world is going to reject Jesus. Or if you're an optimist, you can look at it this way. 75% of the people are going to accept Jesus and to be baptized. They're going to live for Jesus. But of those 75, half are going to fall away. There are 4 basic ways you hear the word, and you can stop your ears and not listen. That's what they did to Stephen. You can receive the word of God, and you can embrace it, and you can be baptized, and you can live that life until something bad happens in your life. And then you fall away. That's the rocky. There is no depth. There's no depth of heart or no depth of understanding. You can receive the word of Jesus. And you can be baptized. You can live and embrace that life of Christianity. But when things get tough, when the world comes at you, the cares of this world will choke out your Christianity. That's the thorny ground. "25%. Only 25% of what is sown is productive." If you want to look at it that way. 75% looks productive until something happens, but only 25% remains steadfast. Listen to me very carefully. I am thankful as I look around the room. For people who are steadfast. That it doesn't matter what the world brings. It doesn't matter what Satan throws into your life, because you're in good ground. fruitful, productive. But I know that we can't do it alone, and that's why God has made us to be a body. And it's, if you've ever tried to grow corn, all right, corn grows better in blocks. It grows better together. Because when the wind comes and knocks down that corn, the other corn supports it. The fruit, the pollen, the produce, it's shared among the corn. It's just like the church. We need each other. Maybe you need us tonight. The invitation's yours. If you're subject to it, please come as we stand and as we sing.